Hi, my name is Dan, and this is another video where I talk about the history of Hartford, Connecticut. In downtown Hartford, on the middle of the block on the south side of Asylum Street, between Main and Trumbull Streets, is a 5-story building that has retail shops at street level and a parking garage above. It was built in the mid-1960s for the Hartford National Bank and Trust Company, which was also building its new office tower at 777 Main Street at the corner of Main and Pearl Streets. Work had started on the adjacent retail and parking building when, in March of 1966, city officials suddenly ordered a halt to construction. They had discovered that the structure's overhanging upper floors and 4 of its 8 columns extended several inches over the building line, which on this particular block of Asylum Street was irregular, slanting inward from the street line, instead of running parallel to it. The original plan drawn up by the engineers had not taken this discrepancy into account. Luckily, the mistake was discovered at an early stage in construction, so a delay of only a few weeks was required to demolish and replace the offending columns and reform the concrete on the second floor with a reduced overhang. The completed mid-century modern building has continued to be a fixture on Asylum Street ever since. But what was here before the 1960s? This is an 1890s view west up Asylum Street towards Trumbull Street. On the left are the buildings that stood where the garage building is located today. I talked about the building at 45 to 55 Main Street in an earlier video, which I'll link in the description below. This building was occupied by A.L. Foster & Company's clothing store from 1884 until 1922, and then by Kennedy's clothing store until 1951. The building was demolished in 1954 and replaced by a new building at 47 Asylum Street. The business that would move in and occupy the building until the garage was eventually built in the 60s was a merger of 2 women's clothing stores, Leonard's and the Hartford Cloak Manufacturing Company. Next to this store was a driveway that led to 2 banking windows of the Hartford National Bank and Trust and also provided access for pedestrians to Pearl Street. In 1955, the bank held a contest to name this new privately owned street. The prize-winning name, Old Bank Lane, was suggested by Mrs. Helen B. Dickerman of West Hartford. First prize was a bank book containing a $1,000 deposit. 2 others among the 75,000 people who'd submitted names had also come up with Old Bank Lane, but their entries had later postmarks. They each received runner-up prizes, which were a $50 savings deposit. A decade later, when the new building was constructed, Old Bank Lane was moved west, and it also passes through the parking garage building. Next, I'll talk about the other 3 buildings, all of which were built in the 19th century, that were demolished to make way for the new garage building. These were a tall 4-story building with an elaborate cornice, a shorter 3-story building, and another 4-story building with a mansard roof. I'll mention just a few of the businesses that occupied these buildings over the years. This is an earlier view of Asylum Street that shows those buildings back in the 1870s. In 1909, the tall building at 61 to 63 Asylum Street became the home of the Geely Clothing Company. This store took its name from Mr. Henry Geely, who before his death in 1901 had run the Globe Clothing Company, later called the Geely Clothing Company, at 27 Asylum Street in the Evening Post building. After its move to 61 to 63 Main Street, the company continued in its new home until 1923, when its stock and lease were acquired by Leonard's Incorporated, which, as we know, would occupy a number of different locations in downtown Hartford over the years. Moving to the building just to the west, in 1878, the clothing store of Covey Smith, previously located at 69 Asylum Street, a few doors west, moved into the building's larger east store at 65 to 67 Asylum Street. I think that the stereograph on the left, which shows the interior of Covey Smith, may depict that earlier location at 69 Asylum Street. The Hartford Courant newspaper described their later store, which was a bit fancier, in an article on April 15, 1878. Quote, "The store is large and pleasant, being 80 feet deep by 22 feet wide, and the height between floor and ceiling is 15 feet. The walls and ceiling are white, a gilt cornice running round the edge of the ceiling, and the woods used are black walnut, oak, and ash. The counters are oak with black walnut tops, the entire shelving oak, and the wall cases of black walnut with plate glass front. The counter cases have silver moldings, and each is devoted to one department, as silk handkerchiefs, velvet articles, fancy goods, traveling bags, umbrellas and canes, hosiery, and collars and scarfs. There is also a large stock of dressing gowns, traveling dusters, white vests, etc. The rear of the store is fitted up as an office and cashier's desk. One of the novelties of the new place is a telephone connected with the shirt manufactory of the firm. The arrangements for lighting in the evening are ample, there being cluster gas fixtures of polished gilt the entire length of the store, and the front has 2 plate glass windows 114 by 84 inches. Gentlemen may find at this very complete establishment every article desired in the line of furnishing goods, toilet, and fancy articles, all of the best quality and at fair prices." Unquote. In 1883, the store became known as Smith, White and Company and continued in business until the partnership was dissolved in 1890. Many other clothing stores would occupy the space over the years, including Mead Clothes, which opened here in 1945 and closed its doors forever 20 years later, when the building was demolished by the Hartford National Bank and Trust. Going back to 1878, when Covey Smith was still at 69 Asylum Street, their neighbor in the adjacent mansard-roofed building at 79 Asylum Street was Brown and Gross, booksellers and stationers. This was a long-lived business, being in existence under different names and in various downtown locations from 1835 until it closed under the name of Huntington's in 1993. Frequently patronized by Mark Twain during his Hartford years, the store began in 1830 as Packard and Brown at 20 State Street, when Caleb M. Packard and Flavius A. Brown bought out H. F. Sumner and Company, which had previously been doing business at that address. In 1838, Packard left to become a bookkeeper at a bank and was succeeded as partner by the 21-year-old Edward W. Parsons. In 1844, Brown and Parsons bought out the Main Street bookstore of John Payne and were briefly located there on Main Street. But in 1846, the partners moved to a new location at the corner of Main and Asylum Streets. This was across from State Street and a few doors down from the Phoenix National Bank building. This is the spot where Burger King in the Corning building is located today. Parsons left the store in 1852, and Brown continued the business alone until he was joined by William H. Gross in 1858. These postcards showing Main Street in the 1860s were made for the bookstore in the 20th century to commemorate its old location at Main and Asylum. It was at this location, on March 6, 1860, that the store was visited by Abraham Lincoln, who had just given a speech in the city the previous night. This was also just a few days after he had given his famous Cooper Union address. At the Brown and Gross store, he met with Connecticut Republican Gideon Welles, who would become Secretary of the Navy in Lincoln's cabinet. Jumping ahead to just after the Civil War, Hartford's Brown School, which was built on Market Street in 1868, was named for Brown and Gross partner Flavius A. Brown. He had once taught penmanship in the Brown School's predecessor, which was called the Old Stone School. He was later chairman of the first school district committee and oversaw construction of what would become the Brown School. In 1869, the store moved to 77 to 79 Asylum Street. It was here that Brown and Gross was visited frequently by Mark Twain, who used to hang out in the shop's back room, telling stories one listener described as unsuitable for a Sunday school that would leave everyone convulsed with laughter. Flavius A. Brown was also Hartford treasurer for many years, having his office in the back of the store. During his later years, he devoted less attention to the book business, leaving management of the store to his partner, William H. Gross. Brown died in 1880 and was succeeded as partner by Leverett Belknap. The name Brown and Gross, however, was continued until Gross died in 1891. The firm's name was then changed to Belknap and Warfield. Leverett Belknap was born in Hartford and attended the Old Stone School on Market Street. He started working for Brown and Gross in 1864 at the old corner location when he was 13 years old. He later recalled that when the move was made to 77 Asylum Street, most of the store's effects were carted down Asylum Street in wheelbarrows. As the Hartford Courant observed in 1910, the store was patronized by many notable Hartford residents. Besides Mark Twain and his family, these included literary figures like Harriet Beecher Stowe, her husband, Reverend Calvin Stowe, Charles Dudley Warner, Reverend Horace Bushnell, Lydia Huntley Sigourney, and also the young William Gillette back when he was a high school student. There were also what the paper called the Big Three among Hartford clergymen: Reverend Nathaniel J. Burton, Reverend Dr. Edwin P. Parker, and Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell. As a young man in the 1860s, Hartford-born artist Dwight W. Tryon, who would later become a noted landscape painter, worked at the store as a bookkeeper and studied art instruction manuals from the store's shelves. When Belknap retired in 1910, the store became known as G. Warfield and Company. Belknap remained active in his retirement. He was a local historian and an avid collector of autographs and, of course, books. In 1918, he donated over 70 editions of Oliver Goldsmith's The Vicar of Wakefield to the Watkinson Library. He died in 1942 at the age of 90. In 1920, Warfield took on as partner Israel Witkower, an immigrant from Vienna who had been with the store since 1903. When Warfield retired in 1929, the store became known as Witkower's. He would expand the store and add a lending library. He also turned much of the basement into an old book bargain basement. The building's second floor contained the store's rare and second-hand book department. In 1960, Witkower retired and sold the store to the Middletown bookstore owner and publishing executive, Trumbull Huntington, who also took over Witkower's West Hartford branch and continued the Huntington's bookstore that he had opened in Middletown in 1953. In 1961, when the long-standing ban on Henry Miller's book Tropic of Cancer was lifted, Grove Press legally published the book in the United States. There were, however, over 60 lawsuits in 21 states brought against booksellers who dared to sell it. Huntington, an opponent of censorship, was one of those arrested and convicted for the sale of obscene material. But 3 years later, the Connecticut conviction was overturned after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a separate Florida case that the book was not sufficiently obscene to forfeit the protection of the First Amendment. In 1965, the scene of nearly a century earlier was repeated, this time with dollies instead of wheelbarrows, when Huntington's moved across the street to 110 Asylum. This move was to make way for the demolition of the old mansard-roofed building that had been the bookstore's home since 1869. There was a big sale of books that would not be making the move to the new location. The bookstore would make one final move in 1973, back across the street into a store, now a Subway, in the very structure that had replaced their old home. The store kept the name Huntington's after it was acquired by Isaac Epstein in 1979. His son David took over in 1988, and the 158-year-old store finally closed in 1993. Much had changed in downtown Hartford since the days when Covey Smith and Brown & Gross had been neighbors on Asylum Street, and things would continue to change. These two stores are gone, but a few other businesses going back over a century, like Stackpole Moore Tryon and Harvey & Lewis, which is now a few doors down from Huntington's final location, still continue today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, and thanks for watching.